Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Nancy. It's really been a fun day and a half so far, and I have to say that after that overly generous introduction, what I always say, and still a disappointment to my mother. But it's great to be back at OU, great to be in a place where they have a real football team. It's great to be able to speak to you tonight, so thank you. I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to talk about the moral life of children. I'm a historical and cultural sociologist, and I'm a social theorist. I do empirical work, but I operate at a fairly abstract level, and yet I don't want to scare you off with that. The kinds of questions that I am concerned about, questions of meaning and moral order, get traction very, very quickly. And I don't think they get traction anywhere more quickly, more tangibly, more importantly, than how we think about our children. Before I launch in, though, I want to touch on a certain kind of awkwardness about this subject. And I think it's a little bit less awkward in Oklahoma, in the Midwest. I think in the South, it's less awkward. But in certain intellectual circles, the question of character, the question of the moral life generally is actually a very awkward topic. There was a time when the word character actually meant something. However imprecise, there was a shared substantive meaning. It doesn't now. That's gone. There was a time when that word inspired, when it ennobled, but that time has passed. The question of character and its importance is simply no longer self-evident to most people. Many have no idea what the word means. To others, the word is old-fashioned. To still others, the word is politically freighted. It's code for something else. Like many important ideas and concepts in the late modern world, the word has been emptied of meaning and contested both in academic and in public discourse. It leaves us uncomfortable, and when we're uncomfortable with something, we tend to avoid it. So, let's dive right in. I don't think we, in fact, can afford to avoid it, to ignore it, however uncomfortable it makes us. But since our goal here, and my goal, is not to foster yet another front on the culture war, but to do something constructive across our many differences, let me suggest, for the time being, that we not debate the meaning of character, at least for the moment. It's a critically important debate to have, to be sure, but we need to begin at a place where I think we can find agreement. I want to begin, that place of agreement where I think we can begin, is the shared recognition that our lives are absolutely permeated with moral and ethical significance. Is there anyone here, I'm not really asking, this is rhetorical, okay? But is there anyone here who has not felt the enduring sting when your trust has been violated, when promises have been broken? What person has not faced the guilt and shame of failure? Is there anyone who hasn't known the temptation to shade the truth, or maybe even lie outright when transparency could hurt our interests or ambitions? And what mother or father holding their newborn doesn't yearn for that child to live lives rich with meaning and purpose? Beyond our own experience, there are the issues we read about every day and that often intersect our own personal lives. Issues of sexuality, sexual harassment, fairness in the workplace, corruption in the workplace, issues of wealth and poverty, unemployment, of immigration, of crime and incarceration, and our civic duties to face all of them. Yes, our lives individually and collectively are permeated with ethical evaluation and significance. In this light and in the spirit of charity, I want to suggest that whatever else it might be, character is a signifier for how the self mediates the ethical challenges that permeate everyday life. A signifier for how the self mediates the ethical challenges of everyday life. It's not the end of the discussion, but in a time of confusion and disagreement, it's a start. If we can agree that normativity or ethical evaluation permeates life and culture, and that character at the least is a way of talking about how we as individuals and a community engage the realities of life in a way that's ethically serious, then the question is, how do we carry the weight of the moral challenges that we face? What resources do we have to bear the moral burdens that permeate our personal and shared lives? And are those resources enough? These, it seemed to me, are the central questions. I didn't understand it in these terms, of course, but this was my coming-of-age question. I emerged from the happy fog of my own adolescence at the end of the Vietnam War. My father had fought in the Pacific during World War II, and my uncle had been a spy behind enemy lines in Germany, in charge of rounding up ex-SS agents. So there was a proud tradition in our family, but I couldn't shake the conviction that the war in Vietnam was different. My teenage rebellion took form in endless arguments with my father over the moral rightness of that war. Raised loosely in the Lutheran tradition, I read Kierkegaard as a 16-year-old, and Barth and Bonhoeffer, and then Yoder, and then Gandhi and others, looking for answers. And the question that kept coming back was, how could I, or how could any person, a Christian, how could anyone kill another creature like myself made in God's image? I concluded that I could be a medic. I could stand shoulder to shoulder with my brothers to carry them off the battlefield if need be, but I could not bear arms against another human being, especially in a war that to me seemed of dubious purpose. Over the protests of a man I deeply loved and respected, I applied to become a conscientious objector. I was denied, and then on appeal was accepted, but only after my father, who vehemently disagreed with me, wrote the draft board and told them, though he stridently disagreed with me, there was no one he knew who was more serious in their convictions. And I'm sure that that swung the vote. When we face dilemmas as personally and politically and morally fraught as this, what is there to help carry the weight of such decisions? Over the course of my years in college, I lost 3 very close friends, 2 to cancer and 1 to a congenital heart failure. The latter died in my arms as we took him in the back of a station wagon, rushed him to the hospital. How do we carry the weight of such loss? How do we bear the burden of such sorrow? And then I faced my own mortality as a young man in a hospital in a country far away from home, as doctors told me I had days to live if the medicine they were pumping through my veins didn't work. Out, brief candle. In the words of Macbeth, is life but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more? Is life really nothing more than a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing? How do we carry the weight of the meaning or meaninglessness of our lives? My life isn't anything particularly special. You can all read your own stories into these questions. Yes, all of our lives and our entire world is filled with ethical significance, and the question of character is, at the very least, a question of how we face up to those challenges in ways that are morally serious. Whether or not people understand the word character or even like the word, these questions matter, and they matter to everyone, and they matter profoundly and enduringly to the young as well. The sum and substance of my talk this evening revolves around the question, what provides the best account of the moral and ethical formation of the young? From there, it's the practical question: what are the resources available to us to help cope with tragedy, loss, vulnerability? What are the resources that give us courage and hope? What are the resources that orient us toward justice and benevolence? I believe that our accounts today are too thin, and thus the resources available to children are also too thin. We need to thicken them up, not in a way that returns us to the past, because that would be impossible anyway, but in a way that is more adequate to the realities and challenges we face in the late modern world. To explain what I mean, I'd like to address three questions. First, I want to reflect a little bit about where we are on this question, of how we think about the moral life of children, what is the current account, and how we got here. Second, I want to talk through what I think might be wrong with where we are. And thirdly, I want to suggest, at least gesture, to where I believe we need to go. Let me launch into the first question: where are we and how did we get here? By starting with a parable. Imagine we had a passionate interest in apples. Apples are generally tasty to eat, healthy for the body, beautiful to look at, and so convinced of the good they provide, we want to understand them and we want to promote them. We want to know why an apple looks the way it does, why it tastes the way it does, how it grows, why some apples grow better and bigger and more flavorfully than others, and why some apples are misshapen and why some taste like cardboard. To that end, we study the apple, though usually in small batches, and from a particular orchard that's nearby. We examine the skin of the apple and its flesh. We look at its chemistry, the physics of its size. We X-ray and do MRIs to peer inside the apple. We dissect the apple. And yet it never occurs to us to look at anything other than the apple itself. No one looks at the stem, the branches of the tree itself, or the orchard. No one looks at the composition of the soil, the nutrients of the soil, the amount of water the trees receive, or the amount of sunshine the trees are exposed to. It never occurs to anyone that healthy apples grow in and are dependent upon a healthy ecosystem. What is the point of this parable? The parable provides a precise, fairly precise picture of the leading ways in America for thinking about, talking about, and practically seeking to cultivate the moral character and the moral and character development of children, what are euphemistically called the non-cognitive dimensions of child development. The picture derives from the diffusion of the conceptual models of secular psychology. This is a paradigm that has been in place for a century or so, since James held forth at Harvard and Dewey held forth at Columbia. And while the fads and fashions, the language and techniques have changed over time, the fundamental assumptions and underlying concepts have been relatively stable over this century. This regime is highly individualistic. Its defining feature and center point is the autonomous self. It is also a regime that pervades all of the mainstream institutions that mediate moral understanding to children, and especially schools. There have been a few alternatives to this dominant paradigm along the way. Think, for example, of the neoclassical model advocated by Bill Bennett's Book of Virtues as one of them. But the alternatives have tended to be more political in nature than educational. As these alternatives have been translated into practical pedagogy, what makes them distinctive tends to dissolve by virtue of their reliance upon psychology for its concepts, techniques, and ideals. So how did we get to this place? It wasn't inevitable. History is filled with contingencies, and so it is here. Like so much of American culture, a good starting point is the intellectually and culturally rich period of colonial New England. Moral education leading up to the founding of the new republic was thoroughly Calvinist and carried principally by the family and local church. The educational mandate placed upon parents during the colonial period was typified by Cotton Mather's exhortation that children should be taught, and I quote, to remember 4 words and attempt all that is comprised in them: obedience, honesty, industry, and piety. Now, Mather was a Puritan, but Mather's simple advice was nothing out of the ordinary, even outside the Puritan community. That icon of modern thought, John Locke, a few decades before, advised much the same in his essay, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, published in 1693. This was a highly influential book, a 17th century equivalent to Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care. Locke insisted that the child's habits be shaped in accordance with the virtues of piety, loyalty, industry, and temperance. It's difficult today to imagine why religion was so important to parents and other moral guardians, from our vantage point in the early 21st century. Locke himself articulated the reason. To the 17th century mind, there could be no morality without God. Virtue could not exist without reverence for God. Locke put it this way. This is Locke, okay? As to the foundation of virtue, there ought very clearly to be imprinted on his, that is, the child's mind, a true notion of God as of the independent supreme being, author and maker of all things, from whom we receive all our good, who loves us and gives us all things. This was not mere lip service. Like others, Locke encouraged levels of spiritual discipline unimaginable today, advising parents and masters to keep, quote, children constantly, morning and evening, to acts of prayer and devotion to God, and to the memorization, perfectly by heart, he said, of the Lord's Prayer, the creeds, and the 10 Commandments. Needless to say, we've come a long way since the 17th century. The urgency to form children morally and ethically hasn't diminished at all, so far as I can tell. But how we think about and practice the ethical formation of children has changed fundamentally. The entire social and moral ecology of formation has been transformed. The content of moral instruction, the sources of moral authority, the sanctions through which morality is validated, the institutional location in which moral understanding is mediated, the arbiters of moral judgment, the character of moral pedagogy, the premise of moral education, and the purpose of moral education all changed. The content changed from the objective moral truths of divine scripture and the laws of nature to the conventions of a democratic society, now to the subjective values of the individual person. The sources of moral authority shifted from a transcendent God to the institutions of the natural order and the scientific paradigms that sustained them, now to the choices of subjects. The sanctions through which morality is validated changed from the institutions and codes of the community to the sovereign choices of the autonomous individual. The primary institutional location through which moral understanding is mediated changed as well, from the family and local religious congregation to the public school, and now to popular culture. So too the arbiters of moral judgment changed from the clergyman to the psychologist and the counselor. Accordingly, the character of moral pedagogy has changed from the cultivation of a sense of good and evil through memorization of sacred texts to a largely emotive deliberation over competing values. In this, the premise of moral education changed from the sense that children are, for all their endearments, sinful and rebellious, to a sense that they are good by nature and only need encouragement. And finally, there has been a transformation in the purpose of moral education itself, from mastery over the soul in service to God and neighbor, to the training of character to serve the needs of civic life, and now to the cultivation of personality toward the end of personal well-being. And so it is today. Psychology is the leading paradigm for thinking about, talking about, and addressing the practical challenges of forming children ethically. When I use the word paradigm, I use it in the strict sense meant by Thomas Kuhn in his Structures of Scientific Revolutions. That is to say, the assumptions, conceptual frameworks, exemplary figures, and experimental practices that underwrite what is considered normal science, the normal science of the day. A paradigm defines for a field what is reality, what is significant and insignificant, what are the relevant and irrelevant questions, what constitutes data and therefore needs to be observed, and what can safely be ignored. Think of it as a set of lenses in a pair of glasses, lenses that let you focus on some things but filter other things out. Now, in saying all of this, please don't get me wrong. Academic psychology is an amazing field, doing amazing and important work, and we need to see more of it. The problem is that, in America, it has a disproportionately large role in defining the field of moral formation generally, at the level of practice. Another way to put it is that there's a fundamental difference between academic psychology as a discipline of inquiry and psychology as a worldview, spilling out of the laboratory and into popular culture. And as it bears on the moral formation of children, it has become that worldview. So why has psychology become dominant? Again, history is contingent. Didn't have to turn out this way. Why? The field has its own reasons, which are plausible, but more compelling reasons, I believe, are sociological and political. The sociological reason has to do with authority. With theology discredited as a public language, psychology has offered a seemingly neutral way to understand and cultivate the best qualities of the human personality. It is a science, after all, and science, we are inclined to believe, is objective. The political reason has to do with pluralism. Psychology seems so inclusive, and therefore less disruptive and less problematic on legal grounds. Indeed, when you study the history of moral and character formation in America, the enduring subtext has been a quest for an inclusive morality. In the face of potentially rancorous and moral division, a strategy of inclusion neutralizes the possibility of conflict, for it means that no one's interests are neglected, no one is left out, and therefore no one is slighted, snubbed, or offended. An inclusive morality, then, is a safe morality. This provision, in my view, has become the unspoken imperative of all moral and character education. Well, on the face of it, sounds great. What's the problem? The problem is that in the effort to establish a neutral and inclusive moral paradigm, the moral universe is emptied of all the particularities that make it binding on the conscience and authoritative in communities. It might be safe, but it has little or no traction. An inclusive morality tends to reduce morality to the thinnest of platitudes, severed from the social, historical, and cultural encumbrances that make it concrete and ultimately compelling. Let me give two very different examples, one very concrete and one a bit more philosophical. And this bears on sort of the moral logic, the question of moral logic. The first example, the concrete one, is for those who remember, and I may be the only one here who does remember, in which case, take my word for it. Nancy Reagan's anti-drug campaign, known as, through the statement, "Just say no." Am I the only one here who remembers this? Okay. Just say no. Just say no. Just say no to drugs. Because it was an assertion floating high above any argument or tradition or social practice, the trope, "just say no," became a punchline in popular culture. Ultimately, evidence showed that the campaign, on which they spent tens of millions of dollars, had zero impact. There's another illustration, the DARE program. This is probably a little bit more closer to our own moment. The DARE program was also rooted in psychology, and a policeman would come in and they would talk basically about the nature of drugs. They would go through the whole spiel, and And they would say, listen, you can't do drugs because ultimately this is going to affect your self-esteem. And what empirical evaluation has found is that 6 months after students went through that, students were staying away from drugs. After 6 months, they were doing drugs at a higher level because now they knew how to do it. This is empirical evidence. A number of studies have demonstrated this. The second illustration is a bit more theoretical, and it has to do with empathy. What's wrong with empathy? Who could be against empathy? For many moral educators, it's our capacity to imagine ourselves in the situation of others that's the source of our moral sentiments. The pedagogic principle is that children learn from those who are they are empathetic, the array of values that will constitute their moral universe. Even more, it's through our capacity to imagine, to empathize with the suffering of others, even those in circumstances that are utterly alien to us, that we learn compassion and mercy. And this empathy becomes the foundation of the ethical life. Empathy indeed serves as an aid to understanding and a motive to enacting justice. But when it is decontextualized, when it is lifted out of the frame of embedded habits and moral traditions, empathy can become indiscriminate. Thus, in a materialistic and hedonistic culture, empathy may lead a child to experience nothing more significant than the anguish of another child who didn't receive all the Christmas presents she wanted, or the boy whose parents actually requires him to do chores on Saturday when all of his friends are playing. You see, empathy on its own simply does not lead to consistent, enduring, or discriminating moral commitments. Indeed, it can lead to just the opposite. As Bernard Williams has observed, empathy, and I quote, is a precondition not only of benevolence, but as Nietzsche pointed out, of cruelty as well. These again are illustrations of the way in which moral assertions are lifted out, sort of deprived of the particularities that make them real. At the end of the day, we need to know why we should say no to drugs, why and to what end we should give our empathy. The denial of particularity, so pervasive in the dominant paradigm, leaves us mute in response to the why questions behind all moral agency. Why should one be good? Why should one tell the truth rather than lie? Why should one shun cruelty in favor of compassion? Why should one pursue fairness for others when one's own interests are not served? Why should one care for those in need when everyone around is indifferent? These are natural questions to ask, and not just by children. They point to the deep, long-standing questions at the foundation of moral philosophy. Far from abstract philosophical inquiry, these questions are implied every time we witness evil or cruelty or betrayal, and we ask, why did they commit such a horrid act? They arise just as often when we witness acts of great kindness or sacrifice and ask, where did such generosity come from? But the same problem attends the issue of agency. That is, how the paradigm understands people, and children not least, as moral agents. In this model, individuals are conceived as autonomous beings who live outside of history, outside of community, outside of the beliefs, rituals, and social practices of a community, and outside the languages and cultural ethos of a social world. And the perfect illustration is Martin Luther King. He's often celebrated by many as the exemplar of the highest levels of justice. But never, in any accounts of King, do we find any reference to his Southern heritage, his family and community, his parents and grandparents, why he was named Martin Luther, the theological traditions in which he was steeped, all of the particularities that made King King. all of those are stripped out of any account of who he was and what he accomplished. So what you end up with is a mostly thin conceptualization of human subjectivity and agency, where human actions are really caused by the accidental byproducts of brain processes or impersonal psychological processes that are opaque to the agents themselves. In either case, agency is not entirely but mostly an illusion, whereby human reasoning is merely a post hoc form of rationalization. The unwitting effect is to position ethical content and moral agency within a social, historical, and cultural vacuum. The problem in a nutshell is that never before in history have there been generic values. And so far as I know, there has never been a person or child alive in history that lived its life outside of the particularities of a time, of a place, of a community, of a social and political order, and an ethos, outside of the influences of exemplars of good and evil themselves. It isn't surprising, then, that the evaluation literature over the years doesn't provide encouraging news about the efficacy of the psychological paradigm, the impact of values clarification, Kohlbergian cognitive developmentalism, Maslowian self-esteem, and positive psychology have all been underwhelming. Perhaps this explains why there has been a turn in the psychological paradigm away from prescriptive morality to instrumental morality, a place where psychology really can offer important insights. On the face of it, it doesn't seem like a turn at all because the advocates continue to use the language of human flourishing, but what they really mean by it is utility and capacity. What I'm saying here is that they speak the language of Aristotle, but what they actually deliver is Bentham and Mill. In this new turn, character becomes a means to the end of meritocratic success rather than a moral good in and of itself. As Paul Tough put it, character strengths don't come from their relationship to any particular system of ethics, but rather from their practical benefit, what you could actually gain by possessing and expressing them. This is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't take us any further toward deepening the moral resources that children, that all of us need. In short, there are design flaws in the leading paradigm of moral understanding and formation that are fairly comprehensive. Think of it like a rocket engine. No matter how much money you pour into the project, unless you get the engineering right, that rocket will never get off the ground. Or take a great business idea. Unless one understands the needs of the customer, the nature of the market, the design of the product, the business will not likely turn a profit, and no amount of money is going to make a difference. I'd like to suggest that the same is true with our efforts to cultivate a morally and ethically seriousness among children, of character. Until we have a philosophical, conceptual, anthropological, and scientific account that is adequate to the challenges of forming children ethically, one that is adequate to the historical, sociological, and cultural realities of the late modern age, we are not likely to make real significant progress on this question. So, is there an alternative? I believe that we need a new paradigm. It's time for a new and richer paradigm. We can't and we wouldn't want to recover the old traditionalist model of Cotton Mather, which, as I say, would be impossible anyway. And we need something far richer and thicker than the disembodied liberal individualism of the psychological paradigm. We need a new paradigm, one that is at least more adequate to the realities of the moral life, adequate to the challenges of forming children, ethically adequate to the institutional and ethical complexities of our pluralistic, confusing, and often chaotic late modern world. Any alternative must begin with the recognition of three irreducible realities. The first is this. The first irreducible reality we have to recognize is that we humans and the moralities that we live by are, by nature, particular in character. We human beings are embedded within and constituted by particularity, and thus to ignore that particularity is to deny ourselves and our neighbors their humanity. We cannot escape our particularities, and try to deny them leaves us without the social, moral, and institutional resources to face the ethical challenges of our lives and of our moment in history. The second irreducible reality is that human beings are inextricably formed within the social environment of a particular community and the cultures that define them and by which they live. In other words, character, culture, and community are a fabric with each other. There are always statistical anomalies, but as a rule, it is difficult and perhaps impossible to have good character without good communities that give expression through its ideals and social practices a good and healthy culture. The social and moral ecology of character, then, is irreducibly important to the moral formation of children. In short, any alternative must also begin from the premise that there is more to the apple than the apple itself, that to understand apples, how they grow, what makes a sweet-tasting apple from one that tastes like cardboard, and so on, one must understand as much as one can about the tree, about the soil, about the orchard, about the soil that nurtures the roots of the tree and the orchard, about the different climates that affect rainfall, sunshine, prevalence of bugs, insects, and other pests. You get the picture. The fact is, some ecosystems are healthy and flourishing, others are ravaged by drought, acid rain, and infestation. And all of these factors matter. The fact is that children are raised in families in a wide array of linguistic, ethical, moral, and religious communities, and those communities are distinguished by different social practices, different institutions, and by different virtues. And by virtue of being in history, they also have different collective memories, different heroes, different villains, and to try to understand, much less encourage, the ethical formation of children without understanding these particularities, one cannot but fail to achieve its ends. Now to the third irreducible reality, and that is, in our chaotic, dangerous, but ever-promising world, there is the irreducible reality and problem of difference, and of moral difference in particular. In our public rhetoric, we say that diversity is not just a social reality, but a political ideal, a given of social life, but also an aspiration of public justice in a democratic polity. Nowhere has the rhetoric of diversity been more enthusiastically received than in the realm of education. And yet, when it comes to the moral life, our educational philosophies and policies aggressively contradict the ideals and policies promoting diversity. We actually fear diversity of this deeply normative kind, and therefore do all in our power to domesticate the troubling particularities of moral commitment and community. Any alternative paradigm, then, must provide a new approach to the social and political challenge of achieving inclusivity in the face of our diversity. This is the challenge of our post-secular moment. This would mean, instead of forcing commonality in our moral discourse at the expense of particularity, we would discover commonality through our particularity. Certainly the humanist, the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim, who join in condemnation of racism will have different reasons over whether the humanist, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim conviction provides the most trustworthy reasons for their agreement. And yet each provides thick moral arguments that preserve the most important commitments of the other. We will certainly discover other moral agreements about integrity, fairness, altruism, truth-telling, truth-seeking, responsibility, respect, valor, agreements far too numerous to mention. But these agreements will be found within moral diversity, not in spite of it. Where disagreements remain, they can be addressed through a substantive engagement that enhances rather than undermines democracy. My main point is that we pursue democratic alternatives that recognize differences in moral culture and commitment as a matter of polity, but in ways that neither weaken nor violate democratic principles of non-discrimination and non-repression. Creating space in this way for different moral communities to flourish in public and private life might very well lead to conditions that are conducive to the growth of people of ethical seriousness and possibly good character. Let me end. I was 25. I had just finished my doctorate and I needed a break. I went to India for 3 months and lived, shall we say, on the cheap. It's safe to say that I was no longer in the ivory tower and far, far away from the safe, comfortable bubble that I had grown up in. There I witnessed poverty, hunger, disease, and basic physical need I had heard about but had never imagined. It wasn't just the plain, out in the open assertiveness of this need. It was the overwhelming reach of the need. It was ubiquitous. How does one make sense of that? And it wasn't merely physical. In Varanasi, I stood next to a boy as he lit the fire of his mother's funeral pyre, and together we watched her body consumed, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. What can carry the weight of such sadness? But I also stayed in Calcutta, visiting the missionaries of charity. And those who have been there know that the convent is an island of simplicity, cleanliness, order, and beauty in one of the dirtiest, most poverty-stricken areas of the world. What could bear the weight of such beauty, of such sacrifice, of such hope? Through the day I spent with Mother Teresa, I couldn't take my eyes off of her gnarled, arthritic hands and her feet deformed by the most severe bunions I had ever seen, and the topography of her wrinkled face as she went person to person, feeding, comforting, encouraging, knowing how much pain she was in, but knowing too that her sacrifice was animated by an ache that nothing in this world could satisfy. I learned a lot that day. Whatever it is that can bear the weight of our tragedies and aspirations, our disappointments and hopes, our failures and guilt, as well as our yearnings, it would not be found in the mostly empty, mostly sterile abstractions of disembodied reasons, but will be found in communities where prudence, wisdom, faith, courage, hope, justice, and above all, love are, however imperfectly, modeled by everyday exemplars and woven into the practices that define their everyday lives. It is working toward and building those kinds of communities out of the wreckage of the late modern world that is our highest priority. Everything else will follow, including the formation of children morally and ethically equipped to face the daunting challenges of the world they will inherit. Thank you.